The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Nora had always thought was the cruelest day of the week. Not dramatic enough to be a Monday, not hopeful enough to be a Wednesday. Just a Tuesday, plain and indifferent, like the man who had sent it. She recognized her uncle's handwriting before she even broke the seal. He wrote in that careful, deliberate way of his, each letter formed, as though he were being watched and wanted to appear reasonable. She had learned, by the time she was 12, that men who wrote carefully were rarely careful in anything that actually mattered. The letter said, in precise and lawyerly language, that Thornvale, the estate her mother had left her, the house Nora had grown up in, the house where she had learned to ride and read and grieve, was no longer hers. Had not been hers, technically, for almost 3 months. A document had been signed, a deed of transfer. Her signature, perfectly forged. Her uncle, Roland Baxter, had sold Thornvale to clear debts that were not Nora's and never had been. She sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. Outside the window of her rented room in Bath, someone was hanging laundry. A child was crying somewhere below. The world continued at its ordinary pace, entirely unmoved by the fact that Nora Baxter had just lost the last thing that belonged to her. She was 24 years old. Her mother had been dead for 2 years. Her father had died when she was 9. And Roland, her father's brother, her legal guardian, until she turned 21, the man she had trusted to oversee the estate until she came fully into her inheritance. Roland had stolen everything and written her a letter about it on a Tuesday. She did not cry. She had done her crying for that family already. What she did instead was sit very still and think. She thought about the solicitor, Mr. Enderby, who had handled her mother's estate and who had, she now recalled, gone very quiet at her mother's funeral when Roland had appeared. She thought about the account books she had been permitted to review only once, briefly, and then gently redirected away from. She thought about the housekeeper at Thornvale, Mrs. Crewe, who had served the family for 30 years, and who had pressed Nora's hand at the funeral and said, very quietly, "Be careful, miss." She had not been careful. She had trusted. That was the last time she intended to make that particular mistake. Thornvale had been sold to the Duke of Ashmore, which meant, if the rumors that circulated through Bath's drawing rooms were even half accurate, that it had been sold to a man who was either a recluse, a tyrant, or a ghost, depending on which woman you asked. The Duke of Ashmore did not attend the season. He did not appear at parties. He had no wife, no announced prospects, no known interests outside his estates, and whatever business occupied him in the north. He was, in the vocabulary of the society pages, formidable, which was the polite way of saying that no one had managed to get close enough to describe him more precisely. What Nora knew about him, his name was Callister Vane. He had inherited the dukedom at 26 under circumstances that were described vaguely as difficult. He was now 33. He owned, according to the land registry she spent 2 days researching at the library, an extraordinary amount of England. And now he owned Thornvale. She did not know what she intended to do once she got inside. She told herself she only wanted to see it, to walk through the rooms one more time, to stand in her mother's garden, to confirm with her own eyes that it was real and not some administrative error she had misread. But there was another part of her, a quieter and more honest part, that knew she was looking for something. A record, a document, some proof of what Roland had done, something concrete enough to bring to someone who might actually act on it. She needed to get inside. A position had been advertised in the Bath Courier. Housekeeper's assistant required for a country estate, Wiltshire, experience preferred, references essential. The estate was not named, but Nora recognized the name of the solicitor's firm listed for inquiries, and she understood immediately. She had been a quick study her whole life. It was one of the few things she had always known about herself. She invented a name, Catherine Marsh, which was plain enough to be forgettable. Wrote herself a reference from a household that no longer existed, and presented herself at the interview with her hair pinned back severely, and her best dress replaced with something dark and practical. She spoke quietly. She answered questions briefly. She did not mention anything she knew. She was hired within the week. Thornvale in October was exactly as she remembered it, and nothing like it at all. The trees were the same. The long avenue of elms her grandmother had planted, the copper beech near the east wall, the apple orchard gone to its autumn gold. The stone of the house was the same pale gray that turned almost silver in certain light. The steps were the same worn limestone where she had sat as a child and watched the deer come out of the woods at dusk. But the inside had been changed. Not ruined. She had braced herself for ruin, for stripped walls and broken furniture, for the casual carelessness of a man who had bought a house without sentiment. But it was something almost stranger than ruin. It was the house remade in someone else's image. The drawing room furniture had been moved. The wallpaper in the hall had been replaced with something darker, a deep charcoal stripe. The portrait of her grandmother that had hung at the top of the stairs since before Nora was born was gone, replaced by a landscape she didn't recognize. The house was being occupied, actually occupied, and thoroughly. Whatever she had imagined about a reclusive duke keeping to his primary seat, it was wrong. Thornvale had been made into someone's home. That bothered her more than she wanted to admit. The housekeeper was a woman named Mrs. Fordham, compact, efficient, with the slightly wary look of someone who had worked for difficult employers and survived by being indispensable. She showed Nora the servants' quarters, the kitchen, the linen storage, and the rooms she would be responsible for with the brisk economy of a woman who had better things to do. She did not ask personal questions. She did not offer personal information. She said at the end of the tour that His Grace kept particular hours and particular habits, and that the staff's job was to anticipate both. "Does he entertain much?" Nora asked. "No." Mrs. Fordham looked at her in a way that suggested the question had been slightly gauche. "He works. Here? He has a study." A pause. "He uses it." This, Nora understood, was all she was going to be told. She did not see the Duke for 4 days. She learned the shape of his habits before she learned the shape of his face. He rose at 6. He took his breakfast alone in the dining room, which meant a single-place setting and no conversation. He received correspondence in the study from 9 until noon and was not to be disturbed. He walked in the afternoons, alone for exactly an hour, though he had not specified the duration to anyone. She pieced it together from the footman, a young man named Perch, who had been with the Duke's household for 3 years and had clearly developed an entire private taxonomy of his employer's moods and movements. "He's particular," Perch said helpfully, on her 3rd morning, when she asked which rooms she should clean first. "Most employers are. No, I mean." Perch seemed to weigh whether he was being disloyal. "He notices things. If something's moved, he knows. If something's wrong, he knows that too. He's very quiet about it. He doesn't shout or make scenes. He just knows." She filed that away. She had already found the study. It was on the 1st floor, at the end of the east wing, in a room that had been her mother's sitting room. She had stood in the doorway for nearly a minute the first time she passed it, looking at the bookshelves that now covered 2 walls, the large desk positioned to face the window that overlooked the garden. Her mother had kept a chaise longue here, and a sewing basket, and a small painting of a harbor town in the south of France. All of it was gone. The room had been completely reconfigured. She was not supposed to clean the study. Mrs. Fordham had been very clear on this point. The study was the Duke's private domain, not part of the regular household rotation, and if she was found inside it without explicit instruction, she would be let go immediately, no reference provided. She was going to have to find another way in. On the 5th day, she met him by accident. She had come down earlier than usual. A restless night, cold sheets, a dream she could not quite remember that left her with an unspecific sense of dread. She had gone to the kitchen to make herself tea and found, instead, the Duke of Ashmore standing at the window with a cup of his own, looking out at the garden in the dark. He turned when she came in. She had prepared in some abstract way for handsomeness. The rumors had included that. What she had not prepared for was the quality of his attention. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at correspondence, carefully, without rush, taking in more than the surface. "You're the new girl," he said. It was not unkind, but it wasn't warm either. A statement of fact, offered without particular interest. "Catherine Marsh, Your Grace." She kept her eyes appropriately lowered. "I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone would be up." Evidently. He looked back out the window. "Make your tea." She made her tea. She was careful not to rattle anything. She was also, she realized with some discomfort, aware of being in the same room as someone who had bought her home and did not know it, and who had no idea that the woman making tea in his kitchen had grown up running across those grounds outside in the dark. He didn't speak again. She finished her tea and left. She thought about him more than she intended to afterward. It was Mrs. Crewe who found her first. Nora had known there was a chance of this. Mrs. Crewe had been the housekeeper at Thornvale since before Nora's parents married, and she had stayed on under the new ownership because, as she explained quietly in the corridor on the 7th morning, she had nowhere else to go, and she had simply hoped, that someone might come. "I knew you weren't Catherine Marsh," Mrs. Crewe said. She had backed Nora into the alcove near the servants' stair with the quiet competence of a woman who had managed difficult situations for 30 years. "You hold the banisters on the left side, same as you always did, because the right side wobbles on the 3rd step. You knew that before Mrs. Fordham showed you." Nora didn't deny it. "I need to find something," she said, keeping her voice very low. "Something Roland might have left. Correspondence, a record. Anything that shows what he did was not done with my knowledge. If he forged my signature, there may be other papers, witnesses, something." Mrs. Crewe was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The study. I thought so. He keeps everything locked." A pause. "But he works late sometimes. Very late. And he isn't always there." "I can't be caught," Nora said. "If I'm caught, whatever I might find becomes worthless because I'll have no credibility left." "No." Mrs. Crewe looked at her with an expression Nora remembered from childhood. The particular steadiness of a woman who had seen things and survived them. "You can't be caught." She waited another week. She told herself it was strategy. She needed to understand the Duke's routines more precisely, needed to know exactly when the study was empty and how long she would have. Both of these things were true. They were also not entirely why she waited. She was, in some part of herself she preferred not to examine closely, reluctant to do it. It was not caution exactly. She had made peace with the risk. What troubled her was something less practical, the growing awareness that the Duke of Ashmore was not what she had assumed he would be. She had expected carelessness. She had found the opposite. She had expected indifference, the easy ownership of a man who had simply acquired another piece of property. What she found instead was a man who walked her mother's garden, with his hands behind his back and his face tilted slightly upward, as though he was listening to something, and who had quietly instructed the groundskeeper to leave the old rose beds along the south wall entirely undisturbed. She had learned this from Perch, who had learned it from the groundskeeper. The Duke had specifically asked. He had wanted to know what had been planted there before he arrived, and when told they were a very old variety her mother had brought back from France, he had said simply, "Leave them." She did not know what to do with that. She went into the study on a Wednesday night when she heard him called away to the village to deal with something involving a tenant's flooded grain store. She had perhaps 2 hours. She used 45 minutes. The desk was organized with the same careful precision she had observed in everything else he did. She worked quickly, keeping nothing out of place, opening drawers only far enough to see the labels on the files within. Most of it was estate management, correspondence with solicitors and land agents, and various civic bodies. There was a folder of bank records. There was a correspondence file marked Thornvale Acquisition. Her hand stilled. She opened it. The papers were exactly what she might have expected. The deed of sale, the transfer documentation, the correspondence with Roland's solicitor. She read through them quickly, looking for. She wasn't sure. Something wrong. Something that showed the cracks. And then she found it. A letter from Roland to his solicitor, dated 4 months before the sale, explicitly stating that the property was to be transferred without the knowledge or consent of the rightful heir, N. Baxter, who is currently residing in Bath, and who cannot be permitted to interfere in the matter. Her hands were very steady as she read it. She had not expected them to be. She could not take the letter. If it disappeared, he would know. She spent the next 20 minutes making a precise, careful copy in her own handwriting, recording every word, every date. She replaced the original exactly as she had found it. She left the study, closed the door behind her, and went back to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed with the copied letter in her hands and allowed herself, finally, to feel it. The cold and clarifying satisfaction of being right, and the more complicated grief of knowing that being right had not, in fact, made anything better. She would have left the next morning. She had planned to take the copy to Mr. Enderby, who had expressed enough discomfort at the funeral to suggest he might be a willing ally, present the evidence, begin whatever legal process might follow. She had a plan. It was a reasonable plan. What she had not planned for was the Duke coming back early. He found her in the corridor outside the study at 10:15, which was an hour before she had expected him to return. She was walking in the direction of her room. There was nothing in her hands. Her expression, she hoped, gave nothing away. He stopped. Miss Marsh. He had the particular quality of very controlled people, the stillness that was not peace but something more like precision. "What are you doing on this floor at this hour? I thought I heard something, Your Grace." "I wanted to be sure." "The study," he said. "Not a question. Was anything disturbed?" "I was not in the study, Your Grace." He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze, which she suspected was a mistake. Servants didn't generally, and she had been careful, but she could not make herself look away. Something in the moment required that she not. "Your name," he said finally, "is not Catherine Marsh." The floor seemed to shift slightly under her. "I beg your pardon. I looked at your reference." He said it quietly, without triumph. "The household listed does not exist. The address given is a building that was demolished in 1882. A pause. "I checked before I hired you." She said nothing. "I was curious," he said, "what you were looking for." This was the moment. She understood when she could tell the truth or preserve the plan. She had spent weeks being careful. She had copied the letter. She had the evidence she needed. She could deny everything, leave tonight, pursue the legal route without any of this. She told the truth. She told it plainly, without sentiment. The letter from Roland, the forged signature, the deed of transfer, the life she had lived in this house before a man she had trusted took it from her. She told him about Mrs. Crewe. She told him about the study and what she had found, and that she had made a copy and had not taken anything. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The folder," he said, "marked Thornvale, Acquisition. Yes, I've read it." He said it in the same even tone he had used throughout. "I read it when I purchased the estate. The letter from your uncle." He paused. "It was the reason I bought it. I had a solicitor confirm that the sale was, technically, legal under the existing deed arrangements, which it was, barely, due to a 20-year-old trust clause your father had created without anticipating this use of it. But barely legal is not the same as right. She stared at him. You knew, she said. I suspected something had been done badly. He moved to the door of the study and opened it, stepping aside to allow her to enter properly, as though she were a guest and not a servant who had just confessed to breaking into the room. I did not know specifically that the heir had been. I did not know it was you. She stepped inside. She looked at the desk where she had crouched over borrowed documents 45 minutes ago, and then she looked at him. What do you intend to do? She asked. That depends, he said, on what you intend to do. What followed was not simple. Nothing that mattered ever was. There was a solicitor, Mr. Enderby, as she had expected, who turned visibly gray when presented with the copied letter and who confirmed, once the original had been formally examined by two independent parties, that the forged signature was documentable. There was Roland, who received a letter from a firm whose name Nora was told, but did not need to write down, and who did not, in the end, contest anything. The kind of man who was very bold when no one was watching, and very small when they were. There was also the question of the estate itself, which could not simply be unmade. The sale had been registered. The Duke had paid for it in full, lawfully, and whatever moral responsibility Roland bore could not simply erase a completed transaction. The Duke of Ashmore proposed a solution. He proposed it in the study, across the desk, where she had once crouched in near darkness. In the straightforward way he seemed to approach everything, directly and without the kind of soft language that made things less clear. He would retain ownership of Thornvale. He would also ensure that a separate property, one of his lesser entailed Dill estates in Derbyshire, which had been a secondary inheritance and which he had no particular attachment to, was transferred to Nora's name, in full, free and clear, registered in her own right as her own. She looked at him for a long moment. That is not a small thing, she said. You would not be required to do that. No, he agreed simply. I would not. Then why? He had a quality she had come to identify over the weeks in the house, the slight pause before he answered a question he considered worth answering carefully. He took that pause now. Because what was done to you was wrong, he said, and because I had the means to do something about it and chose not to act sooner, which makes me, at some degree, responsible for the time you spent here under a false name doing something dangerous. She thought about pointing out that he had hired her knowing she wasn't Catherine Marsh, which made the question of responsibility more complicated than he was framing it. She decided not to, for now. I'll accept, she said, but I'd like Mrs. Crewe to come with me. She served my mother for 30 years. He almost smiled. She thought she saw it, the particular movement at the corner of his mouth, quickly controlled. Mrs. Crewe has already told me she would prefer Derbyshire, he said. She told me this 3 days ago. The morning she left Thornvale, she walked through the house one last time. She had not asked permission, and he had not offered it, but neither had he said she couldn't, and she had come to understand that with him, silence of that particular quality meant she could proceed. She went through the ground floor rooms, the drawing room with its unfamiliar furniture, the dining room where she had taken her meals in the correct order of things, the back hall where her mother's coat hooks still held the shape of years of use. She went out to the south wall and stood in front of the rose beds. They were bare in November, just the gnarled canes and the dark-turned earth. In spring they would be the old damask roses her mother had loved, the ones that smelled, improbably, of something between cold rain and warm stone. Nora had never been able to explain it to anyone who hadn't stood here. She heard footsteps behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She looked at the rose canes a moment longer. She brought them back from Avignon, Nora said. Cuttings she wrapped in wet cloth and carried in her luggage, which apparently caused some conversation at customs. I know. She turned then. He was standing a few feet away with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the same bare canes. The groundskeeper told me the story. He told it with great fondness. Everyone did. She was that kind of person. A pause. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what was taken from you." It was the plainest thing he could have said, and it was the right thing, and she did not trust herself to answer it quickly. She had spent months being brisk and practical and efficient about all of this, because brisk and practical were the things that got her through. The apology, the uncomplicated human directness of it, caught her somewhere she had not expected. "Thank you," she said, "for the roses." He looked at her then, the same look he had turned on her that first morning in the kitchen, careful and without rush. "I'll come to Derbyshire in the spring," he said, "if that's agreeable." She considered him. This quiet, precise man who had read a troubling document and instead of ignoring it had bought the house and waited to see who came back for it, who had hired a woman named Catherine Marsh who did not exist, who had left her mother's roses. "It's agreeable," she said. She left Thornvale on a clear November morning, with Mrs. Crewe beside her in the carriage and a folded document in her bag that had her real name on it. Not the name she had invented, not the name Roland had used without her knowledge. Her own, Nora Baxter, holder in her own right of Ashmore's secondary estate, Derbyshire. She did not look back at the house as the carriage moved down the Elm Avenue. She had already said goodbye to it the way it mattered, standing in front of her mother's roses in the cold, with a man beside her who had understood, without being told, that some things should simply be left alone. She would see the roses in spring. She thought that was probably not the only thing she would see.